Hey everyone, good afternoon. This is Caitlin Coleman, Water Education Colorado's editor of Headwaters Magazine, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar on reuse. The webinar complements and expands on the content in our fall issue of Headwaters, which also focused on reuse. You can see the cover right here, and find the magazine and learn more about us at watereducationcolorado.org. A few notes just before we get started. The webinar will last for about 1 hour. As attendees, you'll be muted throughout the presentation. But if you have questions, you can just type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be on the side of your screen. We're aiming to leave about 15 minutes at the end of our presentation for panelists to answer questions. Please also note that this webinar is being recorded. I'll email a link to you in the next week or so. And those are all my notes, so let's get started. Water reuse has been gaining traction in Colorado and across the West, especially as we've seen so many recent dry years. Water providers and municipalities are planning for a changing climate and trying to maximize the water supplies we have, and to do so in a sustainable way. So we're going to hear today from our 3 expert panelists about what's going on with reuse in Colorado. And as you probably know, we have these 3, Laura Belanger with Western Resource Advocates, Damian Higham with Denver Water, and Mark Marlowe with Castle Rock Water. So we'll start with a good overview from Laura. She's involved with water supply planning for Western Resource Advocates. She has a special interest in increasing opportunities for water reuse to help optimize stream flows, and is an at-large board trustee with Water Reuse Colorado. She'll introduce us to reuse in Colorado and some thoughts on where Colorado may be going in the future. So Laura, I'm going to make you the presenter.
Okay, and I need to switch, right?
Yes.
Cool, great. Thank you, Caitlin, and thanks everyone for listening in. Yeah, as Caitlin said, I'm going to talk about some of what's going on to help increase reuse in our state. And I want to provide some background up front just to make sure that we're all on the same page as we talk about this. And then we're going to hear from 2 of the utilities that really are leading the way when it comes to reuse in Colorado. So I think that'll be really helpful for folks. So as Caitlin said, and I think most people are aware, with more frequent droughts, with climate change and all the growth that we're seeing in our state, there's this large looming gap between our water supply and our demand projections. At the same time, there's just no new easy access water supply left to meet these demands. So as part of the solution, we really need to use what we have more efficiently. And one of the ways we can do that is by increasing water recycling. And so I wanted to start with a question that is asked a lot. We've got this big supply and demand gap. So how much water are we talking about when it comes to reuse? And that really has not been well quantified. But I think a good place to start is if we look at some of the state's water planning documents. We can see that there are about 90,000 acre-feet of yield from reuse projects that are identified in the South Platte Basin Implementation Plan, and then the last statewide water supply initiative for the Arkansas Basin, and those are the 2 basins where most reusable supplies are located. So that's a base number to start with, but there's more potential beyond that. There are opportunities in other basins, other projects that would yield fully consumable water supplies, so there could be more reuse from those. And then also now we're seeing more of an interest in potable reuse, and I'll talk more about that later, but we can see increased yields from reuse projects due to potable reuse. So I think this 90,000 acre foot is just like a base to start from, but there's likely significantly more potential. And so I wanted to quickly define what we're talking about when we say reuse, because there are different definitions depending on what the context is. There's a lot of de facto, we call it, reuse. That happens all the time when a community or an irrigator, their return flows get back to a stream and someone downstream picks them up and uses that. But today what we're talking about is where one entity usually a municipal water provider, where they reuse their own water supplies that are legally reusable, and they may use it themselves, or they may lease it or otherwise share it with someone else. If you think about the WISE project, for example, that's Aurora and Denver Water sharing their reusable supplies with South Metro communities. And it's also upfront important to acknowledge that in Colorado, only certain types of water can legally be reused, so it isn't something that all communities can do. That said, many Front Range communities, where we're seeing a lot of Colorado's growth, do have at least some reusable supplies, and some communities have a lot of reusable supplies. And the general high-level rule when it comes to what water can legally be reused is that you can't decrease historical return flows from native supplies because someone downstream was depending on those. So that means the water that can be legally reused includes most, but not all, transbasin diversions, transferred consumptive use, non-tributary groundwater, and then also some of the more recent water decrees will have reuse specified in the decree, and so if that's the case, that water can also be reused. And so we've been reusing water in Colorado since the 1950s. Most reuse projects in Colorado are non-potable. That means the recycled water isn't treated to drinking water standards. Most of that is currently used for outdoor irrigation. And if you think about that, that's a big limitation because it's limited seasonally. You can't do that all year round. And so that results in limited volumes of reuse. We also do currently have what's called indirect potable reuse, and that's where water is released to what we call an environmental barrier, a stream or another water body, before it's recaptured, treated, and reused by an entity. And Aurora's Prairie Waters project is the most well-known, I believe, in our state. That project really was groundbreaking, and it has helped pave the way for other utilities to think seriously about potable reuse. So a big issue that we have is we have more reusable water supplies than we currently have demand for that water. So what can we be doing to change this? So on the non-potable front, I'm going to break this into non-potable and potable. There's a lot of progress being made to increase the ways that we can use recycled water that's not treated to drinking water standards. Colorado's Water Quality Regulation 84 for reclaimed water that specifies how non-potable water can be used. Right now in Colorado, there are 11 uses approved, and those include things like landscape irrigation, certain industrial and commercial uses, fire protection, non-food crop irrigation. Last year was a big legislative session for reuse. There were several new uses that were legislated, and that's been followed up by, in 2018, there was a water quality rulemaking that added toilet and urinal flushing and also localized reuse systems, and I think Damian's going to talk more about that. And we're also currently in the midst of another water quality process that would add some other uses, and those are industrial hemp, commercial, and non-commercial food crops. So as we increase the ways that water can be recycled, water can be reused, hopefully there's going to be more demand for that water. You know, at the same time, we also want to increase opportunities for potable reuse. So that's when we are now treating these recycled water to drinking water standards. And there are a lot of reasons that there are interest in that. And I just put a few of the benefits down here. And I think Mark's going to talk about some of the drivers that are specific to Castle Rock. But a big one is increased yield. You can potentially almost meet double the demand with the same initial volume of water through potable reuse, because you can keep reusing those indoor return flows until they're fully consumed. And another big benefit to potable versus non-potable reuse is you don't need a whole separate set of delivery infrastructure, which is really expensive to install and maintain. And it can also limit opportunities if a recycled and non-potable system doesn't reach an area that you want to serve. With potable reuse, you're not limited to any specific use. You don't run into those seasonal limitations. The water is distributed through your existing system, so it can be used anytime, anywhere, for anything. And so, these and some other benefits are what are driving utilities to take a serious look at potable reuse. So I already talked about Aurora's Prairie Waters. That's that indirect potable reuse where the water is first discharged to a stream. So communities can do that now. But what if a community wants to keep that water in their system? And there are some reasons to do that. If you think about once the water's discharged to a stream, if someone wants to capture it, that needs to be pumped back up. So that's a cost that could be avoided if you just keep it within your system. And also, as water travels downstream, oftentimes there may be transit losses that accrue, so you're losing some of your supply. And then another reason is that some communities are really treating their effluent to a very high quality, and in some cases it can actually get degraded when it hits the stream, or that quality is not as consistent as it is coming out of their as effluent. So there are benefits to grabbing that water. And these are just some of the things that are driving utility interest in direct potable reuse. And so that's where instead of discharging it to a stream, you just keep it in your system. The water's purified using multiple and advanced treatment processes. Often it's blended with other water supplies, and that results in a safe drinking water supply. However, the regulations surrounding direct potable reuse aren't clear right now, and so that's a little bit of a hurdle. And to address this, Colorado has joined a growing list of states that are working to develop a regulatory framework for direct potable reuse. And Water Reuse Association that Caitlin referred to earlier, that's the State Association of Reuse Professionals. Water Reuse Colorado is working on a project. It's supported by Colorado Water Conservation Board funding and the funding and involvement of numerous Colorado stakeholders who are shown here. And what Water Reuse Colorado is doing is they've hired the National Water Research Institute, and they run similar projects around the U.S. There is a panel of Colorado and national experts that have been hired, and they're working very closely with Colorado stakeholders and our state regulators to develop a proposed framework for DPR regulations. That project's ongoing. It should wrap up by the end of this year, and then we're hoping that we can kick off a rulemaking for those new regulations in 2020 or 2021. And if implemented, that regulatory framework will provide water treaters with the certainty they need so that they can evaluate potable reuse and direct potable reuse equally amongst other water supply options. One outstanding issue I want to identify is that for these rulemakings, and as reuse increases and there are new and more projects coming online, our state regulating agency, the Water Quality Control Division, is going to need more staff to regulate reuse. And so securing those resources is really going to be critical to Colorado's ability to increase reuse, and that is something that we need to be working on. And so here's that headwaters issue again. As we work to increase reuse as one of the ways to ensure we have sufficient water supplies now and into the future, there is still a lot of work to be done, but we're definitely on the right track and we're making really good progress. One thing I just wanted to mention as I wrap up, and this is my last slide, is that we're seeing increased interest in and support of reuse, not just among water utilities, but also among the public. And that's really important because public acceptance can make or break a reuse project. And so everyone listening in today, hopefully you can help with that. And I just wanted to present the results from the last year's annual State of the Rockies poll, which is really positive. And that found that 80% of Colorado voters who were polled support using our water supplies more wisely through more conservation and more water recycling. So that's definitely, what we want to be seeing. And with that, I will pass this along, and I'm looking forward to hearing what Denver Water and Castle Rock are up to.
Thanks, Laura. So next we'll dive into a couple of case studies and hear from water providers that have been leading the recycled water charge. I'm going to make Damian our next presenter. and would like to introduce him. Damian works for Denver Water's Recycled Water Program as a senior planner. He focuses on regulatory development, permitting, capital planning, customer marketing, and compliance. And we're looking to Damian, as Laura said, to introduce us to Denver Water's leadership and history with reuse and involvement lately with regulations and direction looking toward the future. So, Damian, you look like you're all set.
Can you hear me fine? All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for taking the time out of your afternoon. Appreciate it. As Caitlin and Laura alluded to, we'll be trying to provide a little perspective on what a large utility such as Denver Water, our experience with reuse and in the context of statewide initiatives. So start with a little history, which for Denver Water begins in about 1955 when we entered into the Blue River Decree Agreement with the Western Slope. That was the genesis of our reuse program, in that it was what allowed us to bring water from the Western Slope over the Continental Divide to the Front Range, and that water is fully reusable supply. So we have an extinction right to that water. We can use it over and over until it's gone through evaporation or transpiration. So once you have that water supply and the right to that, we decided, okay, how can we use this? Are there technologies out there that are compatible with treated wastewater that we can make use of? So in the 60s and 70s, we took a look at those treatment technologies and found that there were quite a few that were compatible with treated wastewater. So the next step was to take a look at water quality we could produce. And in the 80s and 90s, we entered into the Potable Reuse demonstration project, where we took a number of these technologies that you'll find in potable reuse applications today in various combinations and produced water, and then ran some of that water through toxicology testing with lab rats and a whole host of water quality analyses. Really a landmark study that's cited even today. And so while we found that you can take treated wastewater and treat it to virtually any water quality, including potable and beyond, the regulatory framework to provide some certainty was not there at that time. And then also the public. We didn't feel that the public was quite ready for this transition. And so rather than go down the potable reuse path, we decided to commission our non-potable recycling plant. That was in 2004. It's a 30 MGD plant that is expandable up to 45 MGD, uses some biological activated filtration and other interesting technologies to produce non-potable water. So the water rights and agreements associated with that, both the Blue River Decree and subsequent agreements, are a big driver for reusing water, but it's hardly the only driver. Another huge driver is taking potable water, taking demands off the potable water system. You can stretch your potable water system, and the supply is driving it further if you supply some of those demands through a non-potable system. The treatment, if you don't need to treat up to potable water standards, it costs more to do so. And so treating up to the water quality that's needed for the end use makes a lot of sense and can save money in chemicals and salt inputs into that system. It's a reliable water supply. We actually have more trans-basin water, so more reusable supply during a drought year. We're actually bringing more water over the Continental Divide, and so there is some reliability benefits to that system. Nutrients, among other parameters, are actually beneficial to the end uses being served, while reducing those same parameters can be pollutants when they're discharged to a water of the state. So you can utilize existing nutrients and reduce pollution to our waters with the same rock. So when you compare a recycling system or a reuse system or a reclaimed water system, they all mean the same in the context here today. when you compare those types of systems to building a new dam or acquiring new water rights, it is comparable to existing schemes financially and otherwise, and so it does make a lot of sense as we're learning with a couple of the dams we've tried to build, whether it's Two Forks or gross expansion. Those are difficult and costly, and so an alternative like this makes a lot of sense. It's also a lower cost to the users on the other end of it. They save about 75% of the costs associated with potable water, so it works for both parties. So we'll get through some of the basics of our program. As I said, it started in 2004. The reusable supplies that we use are from Trans Mountain Diversions, and we use about 2 billion of that gallons per year to provide water to over 90 customers. That's about 2/3 irrigation, 1/3 cooling tower, with some commercial and industrial customers such as the zoo and an innovative heat transfer operation at Denver Museum of Nature and Science to round out our customer base. Our system has 1 treatment plant, 3 pump stations, a couple finished water reservoirs. We also, because it's a branch system, as you'll see in the next slide, we want to have as much redundancy and increase our reliability. So we have a potable backup that we can supply to the trunk of the system. That system feeds about 70 miles of dual purple pipe infrastructure that you see examples of on the right there. All right, this is our system. We start up on the north there and come down to a central location right there by the Denver Botanical Gardens. Probably hard to see, but we go all the way down to I-25 and University in the University of Denver area. We go out to Lowry neighborhood and all the way up northeast to Stapleton and even Green Valley Ranch, where we serve all kinds of irrigation and industrial customers. So as you expand your infrastructure, that next incremental demand gets more and more expensive. And so it's important to identify the right customers, but we also want to identify additional uses that recycled water can be put towards. So the original Regulation 84, which is the state regulation that governs recycled water, reclaimed water as it's known in the regulation, came about in 2000, addressed basic irrigation. In 2004, industrial and commercial uses were added to that. 2005, we expanded the irrigation to even include single-family homes. In 2013, laundries and car washes were added to the list of approved uses, and then last year toilet flushing was added to that list, and localized systems, which are smaller systems that take in wastewater from a campus or a district scale development and utilize it to produce reclaimed water for various uses. But those smaller systems have just a little different operating paradigm and different requirements, whether it's design, the treatment employed, how it's operated, how it's monitored. All those are a little different. So we wanted to distinguish between classical centralized systems and these new localized systems that we're seeing implemented throughout the country and hopefully in Colorado soon. This year and into next year, we'll be looking at edible crops, including marijuana, hemp, and commercial and non-commercial edible crops. So we're working with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment on what that looks like, the treatment that needs to be employed, the management practices that make sense, and what types of water can be put towards those. So all of this has been driven by various utilities who have drivers of their own, but also Water Reuse Colorado, who as a trade organization for reuse has been a real driver and provides support, both financial and in terms of time and effort and expertise to these efforts. So big props to WRCO. Another initiative you'll see coming out is One Water, and that's a ubiquitous buzz term that you'll see every utility using, and it means different things to different utilities in different parts of the country. But the basics of it are you want take every drop and make the most effective and efficient use of that water. So we're taking various water qualities, various sources, whether that be rainwater capture or black water, gray water, all those things play into this, deciding exactly what levels of treatment are needed and what management practices are needed to provide that water for various uses. Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment is interested in this approach and having a more comprehensive, holistic regulation that takes all those uses and sources, matches them up with appropriate treatment technologies and management practices to protect public health. So we're working with them, and they have some funds set aside for the near future to take a closer look at what that looks like, and hopefully one of Denver Water's project, which is our administration building. We're scraping our campus and building our new administration building, which will have incorporate some rainwater harvesting and a black water, so a sewage collection system for the building, and then a treatment plant to provide that, treat it up to Regulation 84 standards, the reclaimed water standards, and then provide that for toilet flushing and landscape irrigation. So hopefully we can blaze the trail a little bit and work out the kinks in our system, so that our customers and customers of other municipalities can take that same road down the road when this is a little more established. So looking forward to that. As Laura mentioned, potable reuse is also a real important initiative that'll be coming down the road. As she mentioned, public acceptance is crucial. You can't get a project off the ground unless you have public support, and it takes a lot of groundwork being laid to get to that point. And in that effort, part of that for Denver Water was partnering with Water Reuse Colorado, the Colorado Water Conservation Board, and a number of consultants like Carollo and other vendors who came together to establish a demonstration facility, which was essentially a pilot, bringing potable water, potable reuse treatment to bear. One important aspect was it was not using reverse osmosis. Reverse osmosis is a great technology, but it takes everything out of the water, including all the salts that accumulate in any wastewater process. And then when you take them out, you need to do something with that. And there's a number of methods for disposal of that, but they're all expensive and difficult from a permitting standpoint. And so finding a non-RO treatment, which we utilized in this project, biological activated filtration, was important to make it viable for inland locations. And so demonstrating that was important. We produced water in batches, provided that water for testing to make sure it met drinking water standards, and then provided that water to tours for tastings. And then we also made beer with that water through one of our partners, Declaration Brewing. That's been done before, but this next step with the wine production has not been done. We partnered with Inventions down in the Tech Center to take our water and utilize it in the winemaking process and produce wine that was made from this purified water. So that was unique, and all those items were used for outreach in dozens of events, some of those being Denver Water Centennial events. We brought legislators and decision makers from around the state in for those tours, and so that's an important aspect, and we're hoping that Denver Water, while we're not in a position to be needing this in the near future, we know that at some point we probably will, and we want to make sure that it's a viable option, not just for us, but for the state as a whole, as a number of utilities are actually looking at this on a shorter term planning horizon. So I will turn that over for Mark to talk about his projects in Castle Rock.
All right, thanks, Damian. So Mark, you should be the presenter now, and everyone else will finally hear from Mark Marlowe, Director of Utilities for Castle Rock Water. Mark has been leading the charge to secure a long-term renewable water supply for Castle Rock, so we'll hear what's going on with him and why it matters for a town like Castle Rock's future.
Good afternoon, Caitlin. Can you hear me okay then?
Yeah, you sound great.
Okay, good. All right. Well, this is my first webinar as a presenter. I have to admit it's a little weird for me not to be able to see the folks I'm talking to. So if I sound a little awkward, it's because I feel a little awkward doing it this way. But anyways, this group is getting to see Castle Rock's new reuse logo before anyone else. So the logo here is in the middle of your screen. You'll notice the word purified in the logo. And that is because purified is tested well with the public when you're talking about reuse water. So we used it in our logo. So reuse has been talked about as an important long-term solution for Castle Rock since at least 1982. And in fact, dual piping systems, that's the purple pipe, were put in place in some areas for non-potable reuse back in the late 80s. Unfortunately, until this point, those pipes were not put into actual use, and towns and cities downstream of Castle Rock have been doing de facto reuse on our treated wastewater. By 2006, we did get plans finally put into place for indirect potable reuse. Community outreach started back in 2006, and we've talked about reuse in the community ever since that time. We've been pretty blunt, as you can see by this example of one of our early mailers that we sent to all of our customers, where it talks about the bottom line. We're going to, you flush it down the toilet, it goes to the wastewater plant, gets treated, and then we're going to reuse it. So Laura and Damian talked about this. One of the reasons reuse makes so much sense for Castle Rock is that most of our water rights can be reused to extinction. And of course, this is a critical issue for reuse to become more common in Colorado. And one of the first questions folks need to ask themselves if they're going to do a reuse project is, do their water rights allow them to reuse the water? And of course, for us, the answer is yes. For some others in Colorado, that may not be the case. You can see our long-term water sources on the right. Reuse is a huge chunk. Ultimately, the Wise water is also reuse water, and this is the water we get from Aurora and Denver. So if you combine that with our internal reuse program, we could have a supply over 40% reuse in the future. So that's pretty exciting for us. So this just shows the infrastructure. We have our WISE infrastructure in place, so we're already getting reuse water today. We're getting ready to start construction on a pump station and pipeline to bring our indirect potable reuse water back from Sedalia, which is located north of Castle Rock. This pipeline will go right by our wastewater treatment plant, and we will be leaving a valve and a blind flange for a potential future direct potable reuse project, which I'll talk more about in a minute. We have preliminary designs in place to put reuse water in Reuter Hess Reservoir, which you can see on this map. And we already have a deal with Parker Water to capture some of our treated wastewater, which is discharged on the east side of town by the Pinery into Cherry Creek, and Parker moves that into Reuter Hess Reservoir for us, and we used some of that reuse water last year. Our reuse water also can go to Chatfield, where eventually we'll have a pipe to bring that back to town. And then this spring, we are actually finally connecting to some of that old non-potable reuse pipe that was put in the ground back in the late 80s. And we're going to connect the pipeline from that to our Red Hawk Golf Course facility. So we'll finally be doing non-potable reuse, hopefully later this summer after all these years. So it only took about 3 or 4 decades, but that's okay. Recently, Council approved a gray water ordinance in Castle Rock. So we will now be able to do non-potable reuse inside of new houses where they take shower water and bathroom faucet water and laundry water and reuse that for toilet flushing in new homes. As part of our indirect potable reuse project, we're upgrading our Plum Creek water purification facility with additional treatment processes to treat for contaminants of emerging concern and all the other fun stuff that's not regulated and not necessarily removed in the treatment at the wastewater treatment plant. One of our key strategic moves was to design the upgrades to be capable of treating direct potable reuse water so that we would be prepared to make a seamless transition to direct potable reuse in the future. We also, however, didn't want to have to deal with the brine from reverse osmosis. So below you can see here in the slide the treatment process we plan to put in place. The new processes we'll be adding include ozone, biologically active filters, biologically active carbon filters, ozone disinfection, granular activated carbon polishing, and UV disinfection. And this, of course, will supplement our existing aeration, flocculation, sedimentation, and membrane filtration process. Of course, there's no guarantee that processes we put in place will meet future DPR regulations in Colorado when and if they're put in place. Obviously, we do believe this will get us very close to meeting those, however, and we'll certainly take any additional steps when necessary. Finally, we will have to pay attention to total dissolved solids, which of course are not necessarily removed by the treatment process we're putting in place. Most of the time, our studies show that we'll be fine because we'll be using blending to ensure that we don't have an issue in the natural stream and at the plant. However, we have determined in snow season we might have some problems, as the use of magnesium chloride on our streets can cause spikes in the total dissolved solids in the creek. So that's something we'll have to monitor going forward. Although others have proven similar treatment processes to ones we're putting in place, we wanted to make sure that this specific treatment train would work for us on our water. And so we did bench scale testing. And I would recommend anyone planning an IPR or DPR project to do this. It provides a great deal of data for design, of course. It builds confidence with your team. And then, of course, it gives you the proof you can use with your customers that shows that it works. And in the picture, you can see the water gets better going to the right. And I like this excitation emission matrix or heat map that they use to determine what's left in the water. And it's kind of cool because up in the top left, you can see the untreated water, and then down in the bottom left, you can see the treated water, which gets very blue, which is clean. And we removed almost all of the contaminants of emerging concern and other stuff through the bench scale testing. So even though we did bench scale testing, we also wanted to pilot test some of the more complex treatment processes. So we brought in a pilot treatment unit to test the biologically active carbon filters and the ozone treatment. We ran that pilot test for about 6 months, and we did something in that I also recommend for anybody that's considering a reuse project like this. We had our operators actually run the pilot project, and this gave them a ton of experience with the process, which is, not a common process for these guys, and then built confidence in the treatment as well for them. And this just shows you an example of some of the results from the pilot plant testing. We had excellent removal, and the results through these first few processes were consistent with what we were seeing in the bench scale testing, which obviously gives us more confidence in what we're doing. I do want to talk just a little bit about going forward. So I mentioned we're interested in direct potable reuse, and we've been planning for that. We've also started to message that to our customers and stakeholders. We've put that into our Water Resources Strategic Master Plan back in 2016, which was approved by our council in early 2017. And we're already talking in the community about the fact that we're going to eventually want to go to direct potable reuse. In fact, I'm presenting at our Rotary Club tomorrow, and I will be talking about it then. So hopefully I don't get run out of the club. Outreach, of course, is a huge part of this process, and it's a long-term process. And I think one of the reasons we're in very good shape locally is that we started early and we've continued. So we've been messaging reuse for over a decade. And you can see we've been doing all kinds of things relative to that messaging in the list of outreach here. I do want to thank Denver Water. We are hosting an open house on reuse actually on February 23rd, and Denver Water donated some of that great wine that they made with some of their reuse water that was produced in their pilot test over the summer, which used a very similar process to what we're going to be using in our project. So it's going to be a great chance for us to let our customers see what wine tastes like made with direct potable reuse water. And then kind of in closing, why indirect potable reuse? And obviously, it is currently, quite frankly, one of our cheapest and most renewable, most reliable water sources with respect to the future. You can see here an example. Fully developed renewable water for us is going to be well over $30,000 an acre foot, maybe as much as 45, and we can do this reuse water for significantly less. We own the water, so there's not a lot of risk there. It does provide increased drought reliability for us, and with our system, we don't have a lot of permitting to do. And perhaps the thing that I'm most excited about is we don't have to go to water court with respect to this water source. I think these are some of the same reasons that most of the South Metro Water Supply Authority members are already doing some reuse or moving towards reuse. I think long-term estimates are that as much as 28% of the South Metro Water Supply Authority's water supply for the members will be from reuse, which is pretty cool. I think South Metro members will comprise a large amount of the future 58,000 acre foot that the state's water plan estimates will be reused in the South Platte Basin. And of course, as Laura mentioned, I'm sure that can expand as well. And then of course, direct potable reuse for us is even better. It decreases the costs an additional amount, assuming we don't have to add a lot of additional treatment. But more importantly, it has better drought reliability for us. I think Laura talked about the fact that when you put the water back in the stream and let it go down to a diversion, you may lose some of that water in transit. And that, in fact, is the primary reason we want to go to direct potable reuse, is to ensure that we don't lose any of the water that we own. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Laura.
All right, thanks a lot, Mark. So I think we'll take questions now if anybody has questions. And it looks like we have a few coming in. So if you happen to join our presentation late and you'd like to pose a question, you're on mute, but you can use the questions section of your GoToWebinar dashboard, which should be located on the side of your screen. And you can type your question in, and I'll read them aloud so our panelists can respond. So Damian, Laura, and Mark, if you guys are on mute, unmute yourselves. And let's see what questions we have so far. So let's start with a question from Lisa Buchanan. Can individual homeowners install a gray water recycling unit in their homes in Colorado?
I can definitely take that one since we just did this in Castle Rock. So it's legal to use gray water in Colorado, but your local jurisdiction has to adopt the state's rules and requirements or regulations for that to be able to go forward. That's why Castle Rock passed an ordinance locally to allow gray water use locally. In Castle Rock, we only made that applicable for new homes. We did not make that applicable for existing homes because of the complexities of trying to change plumbing. And Castle Rock Water is, under our ordinance, required to review the systems and approve the systems before they're put in.
And I can add to that, Mark. I think only Pitkin County and Denver are the only other municipalities that have gone through the ordinance process to have some local regulatory authority there.
All right. And the next question, what would be the difference in monitoring of the reuse water, like DPR or IPR, versus ground or surface water?
So I can start out and let others chime in. This is Damian with Denver Water. I think most of that has yet to be determined. We are in the process of developing a framework into which we'll populate actual regs in the future, but monitoring is a big portion of that. And while a lot of the contaminants that are covered in any monitoring, existing monitoring, whether it's groundwater or surface water, there are additional considerations in place because of the source water and you know, because this is new, there's also a little bit of belt and suspenders approach to make sure that we're able to maintain the public's trust.
Yeah, that's correct. I think for indirect potable reuse, certainly Castle Rock will be monitoring more than what is required under federal and state requirements for existing surface and groundwater supplies. I think Damian's exactly right that the requirements for direct potable reuse monitoring have not really been developed yet, but they'll certainly be significantly more stringent than what's required for existing surface and groundwater systems.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, the next step, the reason for the more monitoring is then related to that, then there need to be, well, what do you do if there is an upset condition? And so there'll need to be, response plans put in place and, access to your regular potable water system, for example, just to make sure that folks do have the water that they need if an upset condition is to be identified through that more stringent monitoring.
We do have some examples to look through. There have been a couple direct potable reuse projects in Texas that have some data to pull from and some regulatory context there, as well as California has gone through the process of painstakingly developing robust regulations, and those will be out in the not too distant future.
Great, thanks. Another question. In the past, there has been concern about reuse water on vegetation. How is this issue being addressed?
I can start out on this one. This is Damian from Denver Water again. We are working with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment right now in the stakeholder process that will lead up to a rulemaking whereby we'll be addressing, part of the stakeholder process is to make sure we have identified all the concerns that are out there, whether it's public, regulators, utilities, anybody that has an issue. We want to make sure we have it out so we can get an answer and get any evidence needed to collected to prove that anything we propose is protective of public health. So we'll be going through that stakeholder process in the next year plus, and we should end up with something that everyone feels is protective of public health, and the public will have input into that process as well. So that's the goal.
And Damian, Mark Marlowe here, just to add on that, I think that's mainly for edible vegetation or crops that you're probably speaking to. I mean, for existing vegetation like golf courses and other things, the current regulations have been developed to be protective of the public for putting non-potable reuse water on those items.
And this is kind of a fun question. What about potable reuse water for water parks?
I think once you're in the potable reuse realm, you typically would introduce that purified water into your normal distribution system, and it would be part of your treated water supply, and therefore be used for everything depending on hydraulics and location. But there would be nothing stopping potable reuse from being used for any use. In terms of non-potable, I think, Laura, you can probably speak to this a little better. I think there are states that have that in existing regulations, but it is not currently allowed by Regulation 84 in Colorado.
Thanks, Damian. Yeah, I'm not actually aware of water parks, but there may be some. I know there's snowmaking, another recreational activity. But, I just would add to that, I think this is obvious, it's that de facto question again, but just, as in thinking about potable reuse, it's important to be cognizant that, all around the country, all around the world, communities downstream of other communities' wastewater effluent are using that as a raw water source and treating it to potable standards. And that's being used for every use at that point. So that's just a good reality check in thinking about that.
Yeah, if you can drink it, I hope you can swim in it.
And then this question, I think, came through as Damian was speaking, so it might be specific to Denver Water. Maybe you all can respond. So the question was, how do you treat emerging contaminants, and what do you sample for to assure the drinking water quality?
So for the potable reuse application, our demonstration facility specifically, we monitored for everything in the primary drinking water regulations, as well as a number of contaminants of emerging concern to make sure that the treatment we were using met and exceeded all drinking water standards. CDPHE had input into the design and monitoring of that process to make sure that we weren't missing anything. So yeah, that's the bulk of where that went.
Yeah, I mean, basically there's a host of things that are detected in treated wastewater that are not picked up by the existing federal and state drinking water regulations. And so when you're doing one of these reuse projects, you want to monitor for all those things, both in the untreated side and the treated side. And the types of treatment systems being used to remove some of those include, of course, the biologically active carbon filters that we're designing in concert with ozone. And then, of course, granular activated carbon on the backside. And then reverse osmosis also being one of those choices that you can use for those contaminants of emerging concern. And our bench scale and pilot scale testing showed that those treatment processes remove most of those things, almost all of it.
I would add a little bit that this will be an ongoing challenge as monitoring techniques advance. We will be able to find different chemicals, new chemicals that are in water that we weren't able to detect will be detectable. And so we'll design to what we know is out there and what we anticipate is in there. But I think it'll be a cyclical process where we'll have to reevaluate treatment and make sure that we're continuing to provide the highest water quality.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Will the stringent treatment and monitoring for reuse water end up increasing the cost of that water?
Well, the answer to that is yes, treatment costs will go up for some folks that are needing to start to treat that water supply. But for Castle Rock and for others potentially, the overall cost of the water may be less expensive. So Castle Rock's options are to, for example, import water from long distances away. So for us to treat to more stringent standards, while it's more costly than treating to current standards, it actually may be more cost. It will be more cost effective for us than importing water from a long ways away. For some others, that may not be the case. It may drive up their treatment costs a little bit if they're getting it from the same place, and for example, going from de facto reuse to actually indirect reuse and trying to treat for those additional things that are in the water that they haven't historically treated for.
And what are the biggest challenges that each of you face? Maybe they're the same or different.
Well, for Denver Water, I think public perception, whether it's non-potable water or potable reuse, exploring those options. We expect that public perception will continue to be an obstacle that requires education and outreach to make sure customers are comfortable with whatever reuse strategy is looking to be employed.
I think for Castle Rock, one of our biggest challenges is waiting for the state to actually develop direct potable reuse standards so that we know what we need to do in the future to incorporate direct potable reuse into our scheme.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess there are challenges out there. I mean, we know we need to increase reuse, and we know there are some hurdles that we need to get over, but I just think we're really on the right trajectory, and we've got a lot of folks on board, and there's a lot of support. So I think we're going to get over them. I think Mark was just saying it's having those regs in place. Well, we're working on that, and so hopefully, if everything falls in line, we will have those in place. And then Damian was saying, it's the public perception problem. Well, if Mark gets his project in place and we've already got Prairie Waters in place, then that really helps line things up eventually, when Denver Water might be ready for this. So I think things are all, something could get in the way, but I'm really optimistic that we're moving in the right trajectory, and we're going to keep making progress. And this is going to be something that utilities can very seriously consider implementing if they have the right water supplies and really help us with our supply and demand gap.
I think a little interesting subset of the problems that Laura and Mark brought up is CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, is in an interesting situation where, in terms of funding, work towards direct potable reuse regs, it's difficult because they don't have a project, on their desk to evaluate yet, as I understand it. And so it's difficult to allocate funding for that. But then municipalities that are looking to implement, like Castle Rock, are in a position where they don't know what standards to design to until we get that work done. So hopefully, we're being proactive and probably not proactive enough for Mark's group, but hopefully we're proactive that we can get to a point where when our next drought hits, we're not scrambling as much as some other states have had to get to a position where we can implement potable reuse.
Amen.
It looks like we have just 2 more questions right now and just a couple more minutes, so maybe we can get to both of them. First, are microplastics more of a concern in reuse water?
Well, I'll just jump out on a limb and say they're more of a concern in bottled water, but that's because our water is a better value. And I would say that is something, at least to my knowledge, hasn't been fully explored. But a great question.
Yeah, I would say it's important in wastewater treatment as a whole, and not reuse in particular, although it bleeds in.
And then this one I hadn't even considered, but the question is, are direct potable customers dissatisfied with the temperature of their water?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know because we don't have direct potable reuse here yet. That would be a great question for Big Springs, Texas, and the other couple of locations where they're already doing direct potable reuse, but I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I know temperature has been addressed from a water quality standpoint, but I haven't heard much in terms of aesthetics of customers objecting to that, because there is a difference, but I'm not sure. I haven't seen anything related to that.
All right. Well, do you guys have any closing thoughts? Last words?
I got a real quick comment surrounding the state water plan. A lot of people put a lot of hard work into creating that document, and potable reuse is called out in that document. And I think it's something that will be important to the state to meeting some of the challenges Laura talked about. And so I'm hopeful that we can provide as a community the support needed to get the regs over the finish line, to make sure that the education and outreach pieces are in place to make these first few projects successful.
Yep.
Yeah, I would just say that that our customers have been very supportive to date, and I think, like Laura said, I think the public perception of reuse is moving in the right direction. We've been reusing water for millions of years on this planet, and I think folks are finally starting to understand that if it's treated and if it's purified, it's good water. It doesn't really matter where the source was originally.
Yep. And I will just agree with Mark and Damian. And hopefully everyone who listened in today, I know we didn't get into a ton of technical details, but, hopefully folks are feeling comfortable and confident, recognizing the importance of this supply to us as a state.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you to our three wonderful presenters. Thanks to everyone who participated in the webinar and asked questions. And if you're still on the line, we encourage you to take the next step by checking out our fall issue of Headwaters Magazine, our website for original reporting, connect with our speakers and Water Reuse Colorado, and learn more. Thank you all, and this concludes our webinar.
Thanks.
Thank you, Caitlin.
Thank you, everyone.